Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Last Man on Earth, Season 3, Episodes 6 through 12. I would honestly say that a lot of these episodes probably are much more stretched for time than anything else. There's a lot of times where we have it to where there is a certain person just stuck somewhere. There is seemingly a point in time where you end up having like a Phil or a Carol that ends up coming into uh, pushing someone to want to do something, and then they will endlessly filibusteringly uh, wear this person down eventually till they say yes, kind of thing. Like that is what really kind of happens through most of these episodes. Or we end up having it to where seemingly a person just kind of withdraws to not give in to the group, not give in to the situation, or ultimately just lose their effing mind through these 6 episodes. We ultimately end up finding out that seemingly Melissa, we were maybe rationally trying to maybe give her a little leeway. We were maybe trying to really just go like, well, hey, maybe she's not like crazy. Maybe there's a rational explanation for any number of these things. In these episodes, yeah, we really have it to where Melissa ultimately is now on the chopping block of ultimately just going, yeah, I don't know. Not quite sure. Not quite sure where exactly she's at the spectrum of things. Whether she's playing around or if she's really full fledgedly who she is within these episodes. So, I ultimately, there is one special thing going on in these seemingly 6 through 12 episodes, and I every single time it appears in frame, I immediately started laughing and I could not control myself. And because every single time when you'd have this thing just being a thing in our lives within these episodes, I was just immediately like, oh my god, this show has like, it's so random, but when also looking at it, it's so like, it's random in a good way. There's stuff that ultimately gets added in here that they probably maybe tend to overuse, but when also looking at it, it's something where it's just like, man, I didn't expect that in this show, and immediately I couldn't stop laughing every time I saw this thing repetitiously appearing because it's freaking hilarious. Um, Going on into here, we have also we really have it to where I think the only person that I think really doesn't have anything going on within these 6 through 12 episodes probably is Erica. You could probably say it's like, oh no, she has stuff going on. There's little things here and that, but like I think I'm like, you know what? What is the point of Erica being on the show? Like, it never really feels like she ever really has anything to do. There's nothing for her to do in this show. Um, and I'm just kind of frustrated that it's like, why do you have this person here if she's just background noise? Or just, not even that, she's just a background thing, a background fixture that ultimately has no real true story. Like, if there's a man that ends up coming into the mix, then Erica seems to be tied to that story. But other than that, Erica has nothing going on for her, reasonably going on, and since she's got there. Like, because there's so many times where basically where I think there should have been story for probably Erica, I think Gail was there. Or when there would be story for Erica, there'd be, hey, here's new person in the group that now we have to deal with them. And a lot of the times, again, Erica would probably find them as a love interest, and then, oh, okay, well, that's going to fizzle out fairly quickly. We really had it to where ultimately Todd supposedly stepping up and being quite possibly a person that is going to take care of Erica. Like, I thought that that would have made it to be that that's how Erica would have story in here. But again, like, that quickly gets resolved by Todd going off and doing what he has to do in these 6 episodes, as well as just overall just like Erica is never going to have her time in the sun, and that's the only real true thing that bothers me about this show is just the fact that we're going to eventually add new characters in to ultimately give another character, another person just a hey, yeah, great you're here, but you got nothing going on for you. You're barely on screen, and you're barely. It's like you have like your one liner, and then you walk off, and then I'll see you an episode from now, or I'll see you in 2 episodes from now, or actually you'll have some kind of thing going on because Phil and Carol have to go out on a road trip, or Phil and uh, Todd have to go out and save somebody, or something along those lines. So let's go into these. Let's go into these. So let's ultimately crack out that double five to otherwise go into that coveted. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time getting spoiled. These episodes. So we ultimately have it to where in episode 6, we ultimately have Tandy or Phil. I'll keep calling him Phil, going to Lewis and ultimately apologizing to Lewis for ultimately just saying like, hey man, like, I apologize. It seemed that Carol was the one that ultimately turned off the electricity. They ended up taking Carol into uh, wooden uh, that wooden locked down prison hold thing uh, to ultimately kind of say that she was punished for taking down the electricity. We end up having it to where Lewis ends up, or Phil ends up going to Lewis, ultimately to sing him a song, and we end up finding out that Lewis is ultimately seemingly having an anniversary. An anniversary was seemingly a man of his that ultimately Phil is like, well, saying, well, hey, like, what is his name? Like, what did he like? What did he do? What? And so Lewis starts explaining these things, and so Phil ends up coming up with a song that ultimately has nothing to do with uh, Lewis and ultimately his boyfriend Mark. You ultimately have it to where Phil just goes off in this rambling, rhyming spree where he ultimately just like talks about Mark, Mark, Mark in the park. Don't Mark, Mark, Mark in the park. It's getting really dark in the park with Mark or something like that. And then we end up having it to where that like skews into the song Closure, 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 Closure. Like we end up having it to where like Phil had sang that song before, and now he's re-adding that closure part in, where and then kind of rifting off and ultimately like trying to make it sound like a different closure song, but it's the exact same thing. So we end up having to ultimately Lewis is to tell Phil that it could quite possibly be that Mark ultimately is in Seattle, I believe Seattle, and so we end up having to where Phil is like, well, you have to go back there. You have to you have to go back there to ultimately leave him a note to tell you exactly where you are. Maybe he's right there, and you'll meet up again. So we end up having to where Phil is pushing Lewis to go to Seattle, and Lewis wants nothing to do with it. Eventually, we have it to where Phil keeps knocking at Lewis's door, ultimately coming up with some kind of scheme to get Lewis out of the building. And every single time Lewis is like, dude, I know you're going to want to make me go to Seattle. Like, stop it. So we end up having to eventually, even Carol comes into the fray, and ultimately he's like, hey, Lewis, you want a garden? And Lewis is just like, I know you're here to ultimately make me go to Seattle. It's not going to work. So we end up having to eventually that Phil ends up going and just tasering Lewis and then dragging him off into the car to force him and Phil to drive to Seattle. Ultimately, we end up having it to where they make it to this home to eventually realize that Mark is not there. So we end up having it to where reasonably that that Lewis ends up going and cracking a bottle of champagne that ultimately he was supposed to crack the bottle of when Mark and him reunited. And we end up having it to where Phil is desperately asking Lewis, like, don't crack the bottle, don't do it. And ultimately, Lewis cracks the bottle anyways and pours it out because it's just like, well, hey, like, me and him are never going to get back together. It's never going to happen. So we end up having it to where Phil ultimately is telling Lewis that he should write a letter to make sure that ultimately if Mark does come back at this home, that ultimately Mark can find his way back to Lewis. And we end up having to where Lewis is kind of like, you know what, that's a waste of time. I'm never going to do that. And so ultimately we end up having to where Phil goes into this whole dialogue and rant about how leaving a note left a number of different things for Phil. At first, we end up having to where Phil mentions how like he was almost going to he was going to leave a note ending before he ended his life, and so him leaving that note, waiting to write that note out, ultimately led him to see a smoke signal that ultimately led him to Carol. Uh, him, uh, Phil, leaving a note, ultimately had brought his brother back to him, where ultimately he reconnected with his brother again. We ultimately push on to seemingly have it to where Lewis ultimately just gives in to Phil and leaves a note, gives closure, and feels better about him being at Seattle. And so we end up having to where reasonably that while they are driving back home, we end up having to where reasonably, we end up having it to where Lewis is to talk to Phil ultimately about recently the like if Lewis had gotten closure, why didn't Phil get closure about his brother and stuff along those lines? And so we end up having it to where Phil goes off onto his own to I would assess take a road trip and go on to I think his brother. Anyways, Carol is so we end up having it to where eventually Phil is to come back with Lewis, and Lewis is to eventually go off and try to learn how to fly with some uh with some plane simulator, which I think was really interesting because we end up having it to where Lewis is ultimately saying it's like, well, hey, maybe Mark is in Tokyo, and ultimately, I guess seemingly Mark is in a billion locations, I guess, and so we end up having it to where Lewis is consistently trying to figure out how to fly and probably failing miserably, and so he's doing that, and so while while he is doing that, we end up having to where Carol is trying to have Gail be her surrogate grandmother or to her children. And Gail ultimately wants nothing to do with it. We end up having it to where Carol ends up strong arming Gail to ultimately be uh, the grandmother of her children, and so ultimately Gail says yes. But then eventually there's some strings that come attached to that, or ultimately Carol wants Gail to adopt her, and Gail is like, no, like you're old enough, like no, like I'm not gonna adopt you as a kid. And so we end up having to a reasonably that they consistently have this back and forth argument together, back and forth, where ultimately Carol ends up getting in a temper tantrum and running off, and ultimately Gail ultimately is like the bickering back and forth is really sounding like a mother and father argument, or a mother and father, daughter and mother argument back and forth, and so we eventually have it to where Gail ends up giving in to ultimately, yeah, like adopting Gail and all kinds of things, because really we have it to where Carol ultimately wants like everything done a certain way. We end up having to where Carol desperately wants to have Gail, Phil, and Carol all do a family photo together. And of course, Gail flat out refuses because Carol wants to do a photo with them wearing all the exact same kind of clothing. Where at first we end up having to where Carol brings in some overalls and like red shirts, and it kind of looks very like offsetting. And Gail's like, I'm not going to be caught dead in that. So eventually we have it to where Phil and Carol basically follow Gail around consistently to eventually get their perfect family photo together, all wearing the exact same colored top that ultimately Gail is wearing, which I thought was really an interesting, a really interesting thing, because we end up having it to where Gail ultimately closes her eyes, so ultimately the photo won't look as good because Gail will have her eyes closed. So we eventually have it to where Gail is to go into the elevator, while, of course, her eyes being closed. And eventually we end up having to where the power ends up going out. The power ends up going out, and Gail ends up getting stuck in the elevator because nobody realizes that Gail eventually gets stuck in the elevator. So we end up finding out that ultimately they are to seemingly try to get the power back on, and but eventually it seems that the elevator isn't all that quite working. We end up having to where Gail is like screaming and crying for anybody, and eventually she goes and tries to open up the uh, the doors to this elevator with seemingly a couple of screws and Mannequin Gordon's head, and so we end up having a tour at some point that Gail is like kind of like shooting her gun out and firing her gun out to eventually shoot herself in the leg because of ricochets. So we end up having to ultimately that uh, during this time we end up finding out that seemingly Todd is to go with Melissa, and they are bizarrely reenacting some bizarrish scene from Shawshank Redemption. We ultimately have it to where to where Todd is almost pitch perfectly trying to sound like Morgan Freeman. And we have it to where ultimately Melissa is trying to play the Tim Robbins character. Ultimately, we have both of these people like trying to do these lines and stuff like that from the movie, which I thought was interesting. We end up having to where eventually Melissa ultimately is her goal is to try to jump Todd's bones, and we end up having it to where Todd is really baffled and confused by this whole moment here, and we have it to where Todd breaks character to ultimately just convince Melissa that she is off her rocker, that she has lost her mind. And eventually we have it to where Melissa ends up going and leaving a goodbye note and trying to leave. She ends up trying to leave. Because we end up having to where eventually they end up getting her, and like they end up trying to find her, and while they're trying to find her, Gail is consistently asking, or Carol is consistently asking where Gail had went. And eventually when they have it to where Melissa ends up leaving off, we end up having to eventually, like, and Melissa ultimately burns all of her shirts to where ultimately all she has left is like a bra, and to ultimately have it to where it seems that Todd is otherwise just going like, "What happened, Melissa?" And that's when ultimately Melissa is to ask Todd to give her a baby. So we end up having to eventually they end up collecting Melissa, and ultimately they end up having it to where Melissa ultimately is to basically go into this room where ultimately they're basically saying that she is not quite sane yet to be with the rest of the group, so she's just put in a room. We end up having to where Melissa is consistently, every time someone goes into this room, she is ridiculed, or she's ridiculing people to a bizarrish or wildish or weirdish degree. Every single time someone goes in the room, we end up having to ultimately Melissa tells Lewis that ultimately Mark is sleeping with another man. Ultimately, when Carol goes in there, Carol comes out and says, like, yeah, Melissa had told me that Mike is my baby's daddy. And so Phil ends up going in there. And so we end up having to where everybody goes in there and everybody is just hilariously ridiculed once they come out of there. And we end up having to where eventually it gets to an absurd degree to where some of the stuff of which Melissa says makes no sense. But it is what it is. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Gail eventually is to try to use a Roomba because she has a little sliver of space that ultimately she tries to grab a Roomba to put a note that ultimately she's in the elevator and she needs help, but the Roomba eventually drops the note and ultimately the Roomba ends up cleaning it up. So eventually we end up having to where Gail eventually ends up getting rescued, and but she ultimately has a gunshot in her leg, and she hasn't seemingly probably I'm sure ate for days and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where seemingly we have it to where also okay, so we are also going to eventually have to uh, transition here at some point. Um, okay, yeah, and I think that is about that time. Okay, so because I was like, where exactly are we in the story? Okay, so we now have to transition bizarrely into showcasing another character for bizarrely an entire episode. Bizarrely. So we end up having a girl named Pamela that seemingly is living on the high life. It seems like she is fairly rich. We ultimately have it to our ultimately Pamela is to make a joke about like why did the banker lose his business because he lost interest. So we end up having to where evidently Pamela's rich and ultimately she could afford all kinds of things. And Pamela's journey is the prequel to everything leading up to the the moment of which that ultimately the Gale and Todd and everybody had found those drones. So Pamela ultimately is seemingly living the high life with rich society, and we eventually have it to a reasonably that they end up going on the news and ultimately mentioning how people are starting to drop like flies. We end up having to where ultimately we start to see like presidents dying and presidents dying, president dying, president dying. Like basically every single one of these presidents then end up becoming president. They end up shortly dying thereafter. And so we end up having to where reasonably that food and everything becomes extremely scarce to the point of like them having to basically eat dog food and so on and so forth. So, or eating cat food. So we end up having to eventually that Pamela is to eventually realize that her husband is to eventually contract this virus. And so we ultimately end up having to her husband is in a sauna that is ultimately to just shield Pamela from him so Pamela won't get sick. And so we eventually have it to where Pamela says, like, well, hey, how about I just make you soup? Like, maybe that'll just be the thing that you need to just be okay. And Benjamin, Pamela's husband, is ultimately just like, no, I just don't think that's enough. I just think that you need to have as much distance away from me as you possibly can. Until ultimately Pamela says in kind, it's like, well, then ultimately, like, maybe all I need to do uh, is really just say that, uh, like, I'm gonna make you soup with my heart, and ultimately we end up having to where Benjamin is to say like, um, well, I would eat that soup with mine, with my heart. So basically having them tell one another in a bizarre way that they love one another. And so Pamela is to just go off and eventually, again, notice that there's a person going and eating dog food almost right in front of her, right in the grocery store. And so we end up having to eventually. Pamela is to go into one house that seemingly is completely deserted because I think everyone is dead. So we end up having to where Pamela eventually goes into this home that eventually seems to have an underground bunker that eventually she is spending time with just her and a dog. We eventually have it to where Pamela is pushed to want to have this dog to speak, say words. We end up having to ultimately, uh, Pamela is wanting to forcibly have this dog say the word milk. And so that's, of course, where we get the episode Got Milk, where we're consistently having it to where Carol is forcing this dog to want to say milk, but it's not happening. So we end up having to eventually, it seems that Pamela ultimately goes through this TV that is down under this underground bunker, and eventually she finds out that there is also seemingly a drone that ultimately Pamela could seemingly use for her benefit. And we eventually have it to where Pamela is flying this drone all around places to see tons and tons of dead bodies collected within a football field. And then eventually we have it to where Pamela eventually is to go and find a person who is by the name of Gale. Ultimately showcasing when Gale had saw these drones before, like what the heck did any of that mean? Now we finally have that resolution. So we end up having to eventually Pamela is to go and reconnect with these people via drone. She can't talk, she can't say anything to them. But eventually they have it to where Todd and them, or ultimately that was the point where they were all holding up the signs, which ultimately we have to where Pamela's like, oh hey, like yeah, I'm down in a bunker, come help me. And so we eventually have it to where Pamela is realizing that she is not going to be saved. She herself needs to be saved. And she otherwise decides to go out of the bunker to try and survive out in the elements. And that is ultimately where we are to lead off of uh, through that just kind of one timed like episode. So ultimately moving on back to the group. So uh, we end up having to where ultimately I had mentioned already the mind games that ultimately Melissa had played. So eventually we have it to where the very last episode here, because I kind of commingled some episodes together, so I apologize if not everything is in complete order. We end up having to where reasonably the very last episode, I believe here, and again, all of this is not exactly in order because I messed up the last episode with a thing that I had said earlier. We eventually have it to where Todd and Tandy we end up having it to where via a shower together, very much hugging one another butt naked. We end up having it to where Todd and Tandy otherwise realize um, that Todd needs to go deep back into Melissa's past by going on a road trip journey to where Melissa was before she got here. And we end up having to a reasonably Tandy is ultimately like in this shower scenario, ultimately talking about Todd's dangalang, if you know what I mean. And we had this like severely goofy moment. So moving aside, so we have it to ultimately this. We end up having to where Todd and Tandy end up taking Melissa on this road trip to eventually have her go to or tell them to go to some home that actually isn't hers, and conveniently the photos will tell you that via this home. So we eventually have it to where they are to scramble to just like, man, like there's no way we can figure out uh where Melissa like hang her hat. And so because ultimately Melissa won't tell them. So we eventually have it to where Todd and Tandy end up going and noticing a billboard that ultimately has Melissa's face on it, which ultimately has a building location on it, so they can kind of figure out where to drive to this building. And so eventually it seems we end up finding out like photos of Melissa that ultimately is like employee of the month or whatever. So we end up having to eventually that Ton is to look at Melissa's magazines, and ultimately there is an address that is, of course, there. So it seems they end up going. Excuse me. They end up going to Melissa's home, and we end up having to where seemingly that. Like that is kind of the overall kind of ending of this episode where we have it to ultimately like, oh okay, well we've gotten there and we're gonna get a little bit further and see what happens with eventually Melissa in this home, and see if ultimately that will cure her or stuff along those lines, because we end up having to where Melissa during the entire road trip was ultimately telling Tandy that he had a small member, if you know what I mean. So reasonably, I think that's all I wanted to say about this review. I think there's a lot of stuff that I rushed upon, but also there is a big key thing that happens as well that ultimately kind of really scraped as quickly as humanly possible through that. Uh, we ultimately had, because there's ultimately a reason for this. we end up having to where Lewis is to consistently go and consistently try to learn how to fly. And so eventually we end up having it to where Todd eventually convinces the group that, you know what, we have to have Todd actually fly somewhere, because when really looking at it, we are eventually going to need a doctor to help people. Because ultimately, we're going to eventually have it to where Erica or Carol are maybe going to need a C-section with their pregnancy, and how are we going to be able to do that? Um, and plus any number of surgeries. Like, that's the reason why Phil died, was because they had no clue of how to go and cut that man up. So, reasonably, we have it to where, excuse me, reasonably have it to where, like, that is the real kind of driving force. Like, okay, well, we really need to do something with Lewis. So Lewis ends up going and going to a runway. Told me go into a plane to go off and fly. Told me go and seemingly shortly thereafter land right into the ground, crashing his plane and utter everywhere. And so we end up having to ultimately, they are to again do a another funeral for ultimately Lewis, and ultimately we have uh, to where Todd is to eventually, every single time it seems that somebody dies, we end up having to where Todd ultimately has to come up with some kind of rendition song or whatever. And we end up having to where Todd ends up coming up with "I Just Want to Fly," the, I think, Sugar Ray song, and so we end up having to where, yeah, like, Lewis ends up dying. They end up trying to scatter his ashes, but it all goes horribly awry. We end up having to where they send a drone out with his ashes, and the drone ends up crashing into a tree, and then the ashes fall into some watery pond somewhere. And ultimately, it's just like, well, I guess that's good enough, because ultimately they f up every single funeral, whatever thing going on there. So, anyways, that's all I wanted to say. Ultimately, the whole Lewis thing was a real, just like, okay, well, I need to mention that because ultimately Lewis is now dead, and ultimately a lot of people might ask, like, well, hey, what happened to Lewis? Ultimately, Lewis had died. Interestingly enough. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, buddy. Bye, everybody. Oh wait, like, there was a funny thing where ultimately we end up having to, our Phil ends up talking to Lewis, and every single time, uh, Lewis, or we have to, our Phil is ultimately mentioning a bunch of famous people, and then ultimately saying Lewis right after that. I'm like, it's like Marilyn Manson, O.J. Simpson, Lewis. Like, it's like, you're famous, buddy. You're famous, or whatever. Like, we end up having to our, like, he ends up mostly just mentioning, like, heroes and then Lewis's name. Because I guess that's bizarrely some, like, that guy should feel good about that, but I wouldn't. But anyways, I'm seriously gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.